What was warp travel like during the dark age of technology? What did they use that might have let ships warp travel without navigators, see the light of an astronomincan before the Emperor revealed himself, and allow safe warp travel between 2 points? Let's begin. First, a little of the basics of warp travel. Normally a ship moves into the warp with its warp drive. From there the navigator takes over. Then they guide the ship in the ocean of energies of the warp and use the astronomincan. It originates from a single point and allows us to position ourselves roughly in relation to Terra. My associates and I can sense from which point the Emperor's light originates, but for exact positioning we must use our observations and calculations, along with other warp beacons established at key translation points and muster stations, and for want of a better term, certain landmarks and guides let us know when to revert to real space. During the dark age of technology, there were warp gates. In the materium, they connect one point to another region, making a tunnel that moves through the warp. This stops the violent energies of the Sea of Souls hurting travel. It's safer. These gates can appear over a number of locations, deep into space, outside the solar system, within systems, or even on planets. And they vary in size. They can also link between worlds like a Dark Age webway. Now these are rare in 40k, but here's one example. It is beyond our current artifice, but it is said that during the height of the Terran Empire of the Dark Age, humanity possessed the ability to build warp gates, said Dawn. Each formed a stable anchoring point in a network of artificially created channels. If you think of the natural currents of the warp like a river, bending and flowing at natural dictates, a warp channel, that is the warp space stretched between two aligned warp gates. It's more like a canal, tamed, navigable, slower than going downstream but faster than struggling upstream. But does it let ships appear closer to a planet than opening a warp portal does? Here's another excerpt. Starships had to translate from the warp at the edge of a system, beyond the Mandeville Point, that arcane and invisible line that marked the boundary between safety and suicide. Arrive inside that point, and the competing forces of reality and paradox would rip a vessel apart. Rebirth, death, the navigators call it. When they talk of such things, most established systems had navigation buoys and well-trodden points where it was safest to drop from the warp back into reality. Once back in the cold embrace of the void, ships then had to move in system under the power of their real space engines. The journey from system edge to the planets of the core took even the fastest ships days. The solar system, though, was older than any colonized by humanity. Two relics from the dark age of the past were the twin gates, stable points in space, and the warp, where ships could translate safely. Both tracked the orbit of planets as they orbited Sol. The Chthonic Gate lay off Pluto, and the Elysian Gate lay close to Uranus. The latter offered a further layer of paradox, as it gave ships a way to re-enter deeper in the system, far beyond the point where they would be wrecked if they chanced it normally. So I propose, where possible, these gates were used as a safer way for ships to navigate to the warp during the Dark Age. It's definitely surer in terms of appearing where you want to, but slower too. Think of it as a Dark Age webway, if you will, fixed points between locations. Maybe there were even hub worlds like we know Komora once was for the webway, where you could step onto that planet and branch off into many different areas. I think this would work alongside warp travel, perhaps linking areas that in the warp are hard to navigate. But in addition to that structure, how could you also support normal space travel through the warp in those days, a safer way? In M40, the Emperor commands the astronomincan, a beacon of psychic energy that ships within the warp can use to steer their ships back into the materium. Now let's discuss a similar concept, the Corval engine. This machine, whose siphon coils ran all the way down to the planet's core, dated back, you've guessed it, to the dark age of technology, and the Corval engine required human psychics to act as both its foci and its fuel. Imperial navigators described the coal engine's invisible psychic light as augmenting and strengthening the astronomican, as though someone shone a powerful lantern, a focusing lens, and so used its beams to pierce the obscuring mists. So powerful was its localized effect that even the warp storms rolling around the Malak system began to recede. It strengthens the light, which means it has light itself. Maybe there were a lot of these across the galaxy, waving back and forth like many lighthouses across the sea of the galaxy. So those rough areas are easy to navigate from the warp, so you know where to come out. And it's mentioned it can even smooth out warp storms, another benefit. Part of this device are the charity pits. In catacombs below the sanctum floor are open-fronted techno-sarcophagi. These remind me of references to how the Golden Throne and the Astronomican are powered. A psyche in there can last from 3 to 7 days. Their life force and psychic abilities are drained over that time, and after their service is done, they are burnt husks. The focusing vein, through gantries at the top of it, was the true archaeotech that formed the heart of the coral engine. Pointing at the centre of the cogitator, the focusing vein contained chambers where talented astropaths existed. Through their discipline, the full energy of the coal engine flowed up and then out into the depths of the warp, until the engine's energies burned them from the inside out, and they writhed and screamed their way to an early grave. We get mentioned here of psyches as a power source. A lot of people say there wasn't much psychic stuff during the Dark Age, but that doesn't make sense to me. And I also think there's a lot of knowledge of the warp during the Dark Age as well. It just makes sense with them using warp travel. We know the Emperor had already emerged as a psyche, so it's not beyond sense that some could be found to power these devices, or to purely speculate they could be made by the technology during this age to then be used in those roles. We know the ancestor cores of the kin, who are called the Votan, can clone beings and give them psychic control of devices. Perhaps something similar was deployed here. So what if, like the series of warp gates where they needed to be built, there was a series of coal engines, only one of which now survives, a network of astronomicans to guide ships, and perhaps particularly rough warp turbulent areas, so they can move into and out of the warp more safely and at speed. Unlike the warp canals of the gates, we have a network of gates for some safe routes and many astros to guide navigators. But what if we eliminate navigators altogether for some warp travel? The kin who left Terra during the Dark Age have Iron Kin, who they treat equally to themselves, and they are AI, and some of them play the role of wayfinders. They make AI calculations, and with these, they help the kin in M40 warp plunge. What if something similar was used in the Dark Age? They cogitate probably paths through the warp for ships to follow. The plunges are safe and accurate but slower, so different methods of travel for different people during the Dark Age, depending on what is needed. A noble, you take the warp gate as it's safer. A trader, perhaps a rogue style trader, trying to not lose money and maybe not working for the noble houses, might want to use this sort of device. And as a last bit of tech to discuss, the Void Abacus. This Dark Age archaeotech, when linked to a ship's auspex and propulsion, would allow for accurate and safe jumps away from warp routes. It can go 4 to 5 times further than a ship without a navigator. Perhaps this was combined with the Wayfinder AI to make travel even safer. So that's what I think some warp travel was like during the Dark Age, what it might have looked like. And if you like this video on the Dark Age, try this one.